Before Tinder and Match.com, there were lonely hearts ads. The year is 1931. No internet, no cell phones, no social media, just newspaper ads and promises of companionship. This was where Harry Powers was hoping to find a woman to share his life with, or so these women believed. Within months, 4 people would disappear without a trace. A small town garage becomes a crime scene, and hundreds of letters all reveal the sinister plot of the man called Harry Powers. Welcome to the Beach House 34 True Crime and Paranormal Podcast. I'm your host, Christine, and in this episode, we hear about the case of the love letter killer. The man known as Harry Powers was born Herman Drenth, who had been born in Holland. He came to the United States with his parents in 1910 and eventually moved to West Virginia. Now, Herman signed up to fight in World War I, and after a 20-month stint, he makes the decision to reinvent himself. So Herman, now known as Harry Powers, stood 5 feet 4 inches tall, weighed in at 175 pounds, and needed thick glasses to help his very poor eyesight. But Harry was determined to make himself into someone else, and so he decided to go into the oil stock promotion business. Now, in 1926, the oil promotion business was like the beginning of the internet as far as get-rich-quick schemes go. They made you believe that you could become filthy rich, and the salesman, of which Harry was now one, hyped up these oil investments and convinced folks to put their hard-earned cash into the next big oil strike. Now, these oil promoters, they would sell people the dream of striking it rich, but they were often left with nothing. Then, all of a sudden, Harry sees this ad written by a woman by the name of Luella Struther. She's a widow. She has a small grocery store in Clarksburg, West Virginia, and also owns a farm in nearby Quiet Dell. She's looking for someone to spend the rest of her life with, but she doesn't need the income. Harry writes to Luella, and before long, they're meeting in person, and in 1927, they get married. Together, they run the grocery store, and for 5 years, things are pretty good. But you see, Harry is restless, and all of a sudden, he has this light bulb moment. If he could convince someone like Luella to be with him, why not also look elsewhere? Now, don't get me wrong, he wasn't looking to leave his wife. He was looking to do something else. So what he does is he writes his own Lonely Hearts ad, the same type of ad that his now wife had written years before, which caught his attention. And here's what his ad said. Wealthy widower worth $150,000 with income from $400 to $3,000 per month, civil engineer, and a very fine-looking man of 28 writes, my business enterprises prevent me from making many social friends. I am therefore unable to make the acquaintance of the right kind of woman. As my properties are located throughout the Middle West, I believe I will settle there when married. Am an elk and a mason. Own a beautiful 10-room house, completely furnished. My wife would have her own car and plenty of spending money, but she must be strictly a one-man woman. I would not tolerate infidelity. Am now living in West Virginia. It is then signed by another alias, Cornelius O. Pearson, and he gives a P.O. box in Clarksburg, which is where he currently lives with his wife. Now, you might wonder, why did he add this information about being an elk and a mason? Well, back in the day, if you were posting these Lonely Hearts ads, dropping words like elks or masons, it was like the old school version of verified accounts. These weren't just random clubs. They were respected organizations that screamed, trustworthy. So if a guy mentioned he was an elk or a mason, it was like saying, hey, I'm not some creep. I'm part of this community that values honor and integrity. It was a way to stand out from the crowd and show that you were an upstanding citizen. Now, this P.O. box that he has all these, or that he added to this ad, it's a small town, right? This P.O. box is in the same place that he lives with his wife. You would think that everyone knows everyone, and the post office, at least at the time, would have been a hub of social connections. So they'd get mail for this Cornelius Pearson and would be curious as to who this might be, right? Maybe it was a friend who or a relative who was visiting. No one knows how Harry secretly got his mail from the post office without anyone knowing it was actually Harry, but he likely chose it to grab this mail when no one else was around. Now, later, it would be discovered that Cornelius would get around 10 to 20 letters a day. With all of this mail coming in, how did he choose between all of these women that were writing to him? That we don't know. But what we do know is that one of the women he chose to write back to was a woman named Asta Eicher. Now, Asta was a widowed mother of three in Park Ridge, Illinois. This was over 600 miles away from where Harry, aka Cornelius, lived. Now, while Harry is communicating with these other women without his wife knowing, he is also in the process of building a garage near the farm property where he and his wife live, and it's completely funded by his wife, Luella. After Cornelius and Asta had written back and forth for quite some time, he made the trip to visit Asta and her kids. She had three kids for the very first time. Now, keep in mind, remember, they were over 600 miles away. And back in the day, the best and fastest way to travel was by train. So he could have been at Asta's doorstep within 12 to 20 hours. Now, Cornelius, he shows up at Asta's, happy to meet not only Asta, but all of her three kids. She had Greta, who was 14, Harry, who was 12, and Annabelle, who was 9. He stayed with Asta for 2 days, and then he and Asta go on a trip. And they left the kids with their family nurse, Elizabeth Abernathy. 5 days later, a letter, supposedly from Asta, arrived and said that Cornelius would be back to pick up the kids soon. Cornelius then arrives at Asta's house to get the kids, but there's no Asta. He spends the night and the next day at Asta's house with the kids. And the next day, he has one of the kids go to the bank with a blank check that has Asta's signature on it. Now, the child is supposed to tell the bank that to fill in the amount with Asta's entire account balance. Now, after some time, they tell the child that they cannot do it because the signature doesn't look like Asta's. So let's let's just back up here because obviously different times, right? In today's world, no child is going to be able to walk into a bank with a blank check and say, "Hey, fill this in, and so I can take it home." It's just not going to happen. But this was way back when. So anyway, the child returns back home and tells Cornelius what happened. Now, instead of panicking, Cornelius then takes all three kids, puts them in his car, and just drives off. Now, Asta and her kids are never seen alive again. 3 weeks later, Cornelius is at a new woman's home. This time, he's in Northborough, Massachusetts, and he's at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Charles Fleming. He's there to meet Mrs. Fleming's sister, Dorothy Lemke. Now, just like with Asta, Cornelius has been corresponding with Dorothy. She is probably very excited at the fact that this man whom she's developed feelings for is coming to see her. So he shows up, and while he's there, he tells Dorothy that he wants to marry her, but they have to go to a different state because that's where he intends to live. So Dorothy packs her trunks, and then he and Dorothy head to the bank, where she then withdraws $4,000. Now, just for, to put this in perspective, in today's world, that's around $75,000. So they go to the railroad station. Cornelius helps Dorothy ship her trunks. But what Dorothy wasn't aware of was that Cornelius changed the address on her trunks so that they'd be shipped to Fairmont, West Virginia. Now, Fairmont is about 22 miles north of Clarksburg, where Cornelius, aka Harry, lives with his wife. Close enough where he can go get the bags, but far enough away to not arouse any suspicion. Days later, Harry Powers, or Cornelius Pearson, however you want to think of him, shows up to claim these trunks. Dorothy, however, is nowhere to be found. On August 31st of 1931, the police chief in Clarksburg, West Virginia, again, where Harry and his wife Luella live, gets a call from police in Park Ridge, Illinois. They're trying to find a guy named Cornelius Pearson, and they want him in Illinois for questioning. They're looking into the disappearance of Asta and her three kids. It seems that the kids' family nurse, Elizabeth Abernathy, alerted the officials that she hadn't heard or seen from anyone since Cornelius showed up at their place. Now, officials, of course, can't find anyone with the name of Cornelius Pearson in Clarksburg. But the police chief there in Clarksburg, Chief Duckworth, he isn't just going to let it go. He gives this information to his detective, Carl Southern, and tells him to find this guy. So Detective Southern then heads to the post office and finds out that someone named Cornelius Pearson is renting a post office box there. So the detective checks in to where this guy gave his home address and finds out that this Cornelius guy lives on Quincy Street. And the guy who lives on Quincy Street isn't Cornelius Pearson, but rather Harry Powers. And believe it or not, Harry matches the description of the guy that the police in Illinois are looking for. Now, Harry doesn't know it yet, but his lies are catching up to him. Later that day, the police show up and they arrest Harry Powers. Now, of course, once the news of Harry's arrest hits the papers, the whole town knows, and now does a woman named Louise Watson from Nutter Fort. Now, this place is only about 3.5 miles away from Clarksburg. Her mom, Nellie, lives in Quiet Dell, the same place where Harry and his wife have the farm, and the newly built garage. So she calls the police and tells them that Harry has his garage right next to her mom's property. Now, this is definitely interesting information. So the officer gets a search warrant, and with 3 of his fellow officers, they head out to this garage. It's locked, but that doesn't stop them from getting inside. And when they do, they discover a basement of sorts. In this basement are 4 rooms, and each room is made of tile and concrete. In one of the rooms, they find a bloody footprint, a child's bloody footprint. This isn't the only thing that they find, though. They locate bloody clothing and human hair. Around the back of the garage is an area that's been used for burning. In this pile of ashes, they find a partially burned checkbook with the name of Dorothy Lemke still visible. Some officers locate a well on the property, but it's filled with rocks and water. Now, it's not a stretch to think that Harry's victims are in this well, so they call in the fire department to pump it out. And after all that work, there's still no sign of Asta or her children. Police, they're frustrated, and they know that Harry knows information that he's not telling them. So they grab him from the jail and they bring him to the location. He doesn't say a word. Now, by the middle of the afternoon, the farm now looks like some kind of macabre scene with over 300 people showing up to watch the police search. In this large crowd, there is one person who steps forward to tell the police something, and this opens up a whole new lead. This person was a 15-year-old boy, and he tells the police that he had helped Harry dig a ditch from the garage to the creek. After learning this information, the sheriff doesn't waste any time in getting a large group of men out there to begin digging. And it doesn't take long for those digging, as well as the onlookers in the crowd, to begin backing away from a terrible smell. They keep digging, and they make a horrific discovery. There, they find the body of Dorothy Lemke, the woman who had left Massachusetts with Harry, or rather Cornelius, just a month earlier. Dorothy is found with a belt still around her neck. Authorities in Massachusetts confirmed that Dorothy had been reported missing. Her family had to then make the journey to Clarksburg to identify her body. In the meantime, they keep digging behind Harry's garage, and they find Asta at one end of the ditch, and as they continue, they locate her children. Now, brace yourselves, because this isn't information for the faint of heart, so be warned. They found that Asta's daughters had both been strangled, while her 12-year-old son had suffered multiple blows to the head with a hammer. Back at the jail, where Harry Powers is being held, hundreds of people gather outside. Some were horrified, and others just had this morbid curiosity about this guy. Inside the jail, Harry is being questioned by the police. Hours and hours go by until around 4 o'clock in the morning, Harry finally cracks and confesses. They take his mugshot, and let's say it looks a bit suspicious. Harry is now sporting 2 black eyes. One of them is nearly swollen shut. The official story was that he fell down the stairs during questioning. Yeah, I'll let you draw your own conclusions on that one. Harry Powers became known as the Bluebeard of Quiet Dell. Now, why Bluebeard? Well, this term comes from a French folktale that was written by Charles Perrault. And this was where a wealthy, violent man kept marrying women and one by one would kill them when they didn't obey his rules. He would then hide their bodies in a chamber in his castle. Pretty creepy similarities, right? And not only were the bodies located, so were hundreds and hundreds of letters, all addressed to Cornelius Pearson. And they were from women all over the country. These women poured their hearts out to Cornelius, whom they also called Connie, who wrote back and expressed his love to them. One of these letters was from an Edith Simpson in Detroit. She was actually set to marry Connie in September and had already purchased her wedding dress and started packing her bags. When authorities reached out to Edith and showed her the letter he had written to Asta, she was shocked. It was a near duplicate letter to the one that she had received from Connie. These love letters had been in trunks that were stuffed to the brim, but not only with letters, also with personal belongings of his victims. It was later discovered that this guy, Harry Powers, originally known as Herman Drenth and then Cornelius Pearson, had been running these schemes for years, even using another name, John Schroeder. This guy, who earned this name, the Clarksburg Bluebeard, had at least 115 courtships going on with women all over the country. Now, because of the crimes committed by Powers, and because it hit the newspapers nationwide, overnight, the location where the bodies were found became this macabre tourist attraction. People came from all over just to see the area where the women and children were found. Now, a month after Harry was arrested, some entrepreneur types decided to cash in on this crime scene. And what they did is they built a 6-foot tall fence around the garage and the ditch where the bodies were found. And then they decided to charge admission. That same night, a crowd, after this fence has gone up, a crowd of over 100 people showed up. They were not happy with this new arrangement, which they felt was a money grab over the tragic events. And yes, it was. So they doused the fence in gas and set it on fire. In September of 1931, tension had reached a boiling point. So by this time, over 5,000 people, yes, 5,000 people, surrounded the jail where Harry Powers was being held and demanded that he be handed over to them. Now, authorities felt completely overwhelmed. This is a small town, and, now the whole nation knows about this, and so all these people are showing up. And so what they do is they call in the fire department to disperse the crowd. But the crowd wasn't having it. They blocked firefighters from using their hoses, and they even tried to flip over a fire truck. For 2 hours, it was complete chaos. People hurled bricks, the police threw tear gas bombs. It was almost like a war zone. In a last-ditch effort to prevent a full-scale riot, they made the decision to move Harry to a federal penitentiary in Moundsville. If they didn't get him out of there fast, things could get even uglier. So on December 7th, 1931, exactly 100 days after Powers was arrested, the interest in this trial was so intense that they had to hold it inside an opera house just to accommodate the crowd. Now, you would think that this kind of trial would take forever, right? Believe it or not, it lasted just 5 days. On December 12th of 1931, the judge sentenced Powers, and here's what the judge said, word for word. Quote, "It is the judgment of the court that you be taken to the state penitentiary at Moundsville, there to be kept and treated in the manner provided by law, and then hanged by the neck until dead on March 18th, 1932, between the hours of sunrise and sunset." Unquote. Now it seems shocking to us today, but back then it was very typical for someone who was convicted in a high-profile murder case. On the document ordering Harry to be executed, which you can actually see if you're watching on YouTube, it actually has a section in there where you can write in any military service that they have done, and it says none. And I thought that was interesting. It's always been believed that he served in World War I for 20 months, but either way, someone got it wrong. It was 9 a.m. on March 18th, 1932, when Harry Powers' sentence was to be carried out in Moundsville, West Virginia. Cars are backed up for blocks. The streets are lined with people, and inside the prison are the officials, doctors, policemen, and even one of the jurors who voted to convict Powers. So, Powers, he shows up to his execution wearing a pinstripe suit with a bright blue tie. And he calmly walks up the stairs. And once there, the warden gives him one last chance to speak his mind, asking if he had any statement to make. It's quiet for a time until you barely hear him utter the word no. Now, inside the prison, where the execution is to take place, it is cramped and it is tense. A black cap is placed over Power's head. Is he remorseful? Is he scared? Is he defiant? Or does he feel nothing? The prison chaplain begins to read his last rites. We commit Harry Powers' soul to thee and ask that thou pardon his sins. 3 men are lined up ready to push a button in front of them. When the call is made, the buttons are pressed. No one will ever know which man's button was the one that caused the floor to give way and Powers to drop through the empty space. 11 long and silent minutes follow as the doctors check Powers over and over again. Finally, he is pronounced dead. Now, you'd think that this was the end of the story of Harry Powers, but it was discovered that before heading to his execution, he had written a letter to the warden. The letter is contradictory at best. It says first that he's innocent, but then continues to say, quote, there are more in West Virginia than in Wisconsin, unquote. And we're left wondering, more what? More victims, more accomplices, what? Now, throughout all of this, you might be wondering about Harry's wife, Luella. Luella maintained her innocence. She said that she knew nothing about her husband's criminal activities. It's said that after he was arrested, Luella never again left her house, and that probably makes for a good story, but it's unlikely that that's actually what happened. Although I can only imagine what she would have went through living in this small town afterwards. As I wrap up this episode, I want to make a point about all of this. Yes, it happened nearly 100 years ago, but it also has very striking similarities to today's dating world. Today, instead of newspaper ads, there's dating apps and websites. And while technology has changed, there is still the core risk of meeting people that you don't know, that you only know through text or through phone calls, or if you're lucky, through a Zoom call. Technology may change, but human nature doesn't always keep the same pace. Many people do find true connections with today's apps, but not everyone is who they claim to be. Trust your instincts, and if something feels off or too good to be true, it's best to just steer clear, right? Thank you all for listening. If you want to hear even more true crime and paranormal stories, be sure you subscribe through your favorite podcast platform or on YouTube. Stay safe, and I'll be back with another episode next week. Bye for now.